God, and not very often am I left wondering what I'm going to say, and that one is a really difficult question. You've stumped me. Can I make up a question to answer now?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
What I would like to ask myself next.
Right now, many countries have their highest levels of national debt on record. So we've recently uploaded some videos to explore this topic, and today we've got our full interview with political economist Richard Murphy for you. If you're new to the channel, my name is Ollie and this is Economics Unlocked.
Well, I'm Richard Murphy. We are recording this on the day I have become Professor of Accounting Practice at the University of Sheffield. I was previously Professor of Practice in International Political Economy at City University London. I'm a chartered accountant. I'm unusual as a professor in either of those disciplines to have no PhD, although I have published quite a lot of academic papers, so I guess I could have one. My background is as a practitioner. I did 20 years of work as a chartered accountant, and then, having been senior partner of a firm of chartered accountants, decided on a complete career change just after the age of 40. No, it wasn't a midlife crisis. It was a plan I had when I left university. Sad but true. This was a plan to change track at that time. I thought I'd become an academic straight away. I didn't. I became a campaigner. I co-founded the Tax Justice Network and since then Tax Research UK, the Green New Deal, the Fair Tax Mark, Corporate Accountability Network, and there's probably one or two other things along the way, all of which are campaigning basically for improved economic justice on behalf of various different interest groups or environmental justice. So I combine the theoretical background and practical background of being an accountant with this experience as a campaigner. And over the last few years, I've done quite a lot of academic discipline work too.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I suppose my first question to you would be, should people in the UK be worried about the amount of debt the government has?
I'm not sure that the UK government has got any debt. I mean, I raise that sort of point, if you like, slightly controversially, but it depends how you define debt. I mean, debt is something that is contractual, that has been provided in the form of a loan which must be repaid, and which has implicit within it the idea that the recipient is dependent upon it to finance their activities. Now, actually, I don't think that those conditions are met by what is often called UK government debt. It may have been once upon a time, and that once upon a time was when we had a gold standard, and therefore there was a restricted amount of money in the UK economy, dependent upon the amount of gold that was owned by the Bank of England and therefore available for it to issue cash from. But the reality is that since 1971 at least, and if you want 1931, if you're going to go to an earlier date, we haven't been on the gold standard. And absolutely emphatically that was broken when our fixed exchange rate with the US did not give us a right of convertibility into gold on August the 15th, 1971. I was around at the time, but I have to admit I don't recall it happening. I don't think anybody paid much attention to it. And that's one of the problems we've got. People don't understand that we now live in a world where cash is just a government promise to pay. So what is debt when the person who supposedly owes the money created the money in which the debt is denominated and can always, as a matter of fact, repay by definition whenever they wish, because they can simply create some more money to make the repayment if ever they were having a little tight cash flow difficulty at the time that it was due. They can't have a tight cash flow difficulty, in other words, because they can always make new money. How do we know they can make new money? Well, there's two reasons why we know they can make new money. One is practice. I mean, over the last decade, 895 billion of money has been created by the Bank of England through the quantitative easing program. It hasn't resulted in inflation of any consequence. It could continue to create more money so long as it doesn't try to push beyond the parameters of full employment. So therefore it can keep creating money if it wishes to repay debt. And secondly, actually, since 1866, which is kind of before anybody who's going to be watching this was around, there has been a thing called the Exchequer and Audit Functions Act, I think it's correct, I call it correctly, of 1866, which basically requires that the Bank of England would always make a payment when instructed to do so by the Bank of England without ever checking whether there's cash in the bank, and will simply extend an overdraft when required. So given that the Bank of England is again the issuer of cash in this case, they actually issue out cash, there is no restriction on the payment of money. So what is the national debt is the question I really ask. Well, actually, the national debt is nothing like debt at all. If we truly understand that actually government has to create the money that is in our economy before any of it can be saved, then actually the money that is lent to the government was created by the government in the first place by running a deficit. So the deficit came before the borrowing, and the borrowing is in fact simply the redepositing of cash created by the government with the Bank of England or other institutions for the sake of national savings and investments, for example, being another institution which is part of the national debt, for the sake of providing safe deposit for people's funds. In other words, the national debt is simply a banking facility. People save with the government, that's gilts. They save with national savings and investments, national savings accounts or premium bond accounts or whatever. But what is this debt? It isn't debt, it's simply money on deposit. That's all it is. So do we need to worry about it? That was your question. Sorry, let me come back to the question.
Yes.
I've done a very long preamble to provide the answer. Why would we worry? Would we worry if the balance sheet of Barclays Bank was expanded by more people wishing to save with it, therefore increasing the apparent liquidity and strength of that bank and its attractiveness to other people, because it would appear to be a solid, reliable place in which to deposit your funds? Well, no, we would not be worried whether that was Barclays or Lloyds or NatWest or whoever it might be. We'd be delighted to see our banks in such positions of strength. So should we be delighted that people want to save their money with the government. The government is the borrower of last resort. In other words, it is the place where you would want to deposit your money for the greatest security. Why should we worry that people believe in our government so much they want to save with it? Is the national debt a problem? No, not at all. Do we have any crisis about repaying this debt? No, not at all, because we have the ability to make the payment. Have we ever had a default risk since 1694 when it was created? No, never. So what is the fuss about the national debt? It's just a number, and it's a good number. It's a great number because it indicates that there is private wealth being saved with the government. And that's happened for a long time. I'll give you an example. Some of you who are watching this will have read the novels of Jane Austen. Jane Austen wrote, for example, in Pride and Prejudice about the fact that there was one of the potential son-in-laws who I think had £5,000 of income a year in the 4%. Now, the 4% were government bonds. That's all they were. This is 1805 or something when she was writing. And so the potential mother-in-law of this young man could work out that he was worth £125,000 because he had an income of £5,000 in the 4%, and he was therefore very wealthy and decidedly eligible. Government debt is private wealth deposited with the government. What's the problem with that?
Excellent, thank you very much. Are there any things we should be doing differently about how we measure the sort of total government debt or the amount of government bonds? If you're writing an ONS report today, how would you measure that?
Well, I did some work a year ago, and I have still not published it, which is slightly embarrassing. But that is the way the academic works. Sometimes other things get in the way of a piece of research. And I spoke to the Bank of England, the ONS, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility, and others about what was in the UK national debt. And you know what? They don't know. In fact, the calculation is so opaque that I can't reproduce the number. I actually did this work when they said that for the first time the national debt was true £2 trillion and we should worry about it, which was August 2020. So I went to try and find out what made up the national debt. And I still don't know, and nor can they explain it precisely, which is kind of weird that is the case. It's a very odd amalgam of figures. And actually, by the way, it is not proper accounting. It is single entry accounting, which as a chartered accountant I take great offence at, because, for example, there are some things in there which appear to simply be in there twice. I think the numbers are wrong. What should we not include in it? Let's keep it simple rather than go down into the detail of that research that I did. The figure that really should not be in there is the money, the bonds which are owned by the Bank of England, issued by the Treasury and repurchased through the process called quantitative easing, QE, as it's become known. which has been in use since 2009. Now, the result of quantitative easing is that a subsidiary company, the Bank of England, so a company wholly owned by the Bank of England, called Bank of England Asset Purchase Finance Facility Limited, now owns near enough 850 billion. It's going to be 895 billion soon. The number is getting to the total of UK government bonds. Now, the fact is, though, that there's an agreement between the Bank of England and the Treasury, which, by the way, owns the Bank of England, that this subsidiary company is in fact wholly managed on behalf of the Treasury, who guarantees that if there are any profits or losses made by that subsidiary company, they will belong to the Treasury itself. So in fact, that company is not run by the Bank of England, and we know that's true because it's not consolidated into the accounts of the Bank of England, which it would have to be if it was truly owned and controlled by the Bank of England. It isn't, it's controlled by the Treasury. And therefore the Treasury effectively owns its own debt. Now that's a very interesting situation for a person to be in. Now suppose I had a personal mortgage of £1 million, which I owed to me. Would I worry about repaying that debt? No, because if I had to repay it, I'd write a check out of my bank account and pay it back into my bank account. Would I worry about the interest rate on that debt? No, because I pay it out from myself to myself. And that is exactly what's happening with regard to this 850 odd billion or so pounds, heading for 900 billion pounds worth of debt that is owned by the Treasury, issued by the Treasury. So is that debt? And my answer is, well, if anything's not debt that I've ever seen in my whole life, that's not debt. And in fact, when you look at something called the whole of government accounts, and you can find those, you can Google them, you can bring them up there, the UK whole of government accounts, you'll discover that in fact in those whole of government accounts, which are prepared in accordance with proper double entry accounting rules, that debt is not on the balance sheet, which is really quite interesting. It's not there. So that should not be in the national debt. What some people, I'm going to anticipate your next question here, argue in place is that the money that is created by the Bank of England as a consequence of buying that debt should be treated as debt instead. Well, that's really interesting that the government is in debt for buying back its own debt, and that the people who apparently own this debt, who are banks, there's clearing banks of the UK. There are 306 of those, by the way. Don't just think that's NatWest, etc. That's, you know, everything down to Tesco Bank, and a lot of foreign banks have a clearing bank account with the Bank of England. But all those people who have those balances with the Bank of England record that not as debt, they record it as cash held on deposit with the Bank of England. So is it debt? No, it's money. So what actually exists? Well, certainly no debt, but there are some bank deposit accounts. So that should be taken out. Do we therefore have debt of around 2.2 trillion-ish, which is the figure that we'll be talking about as a headline number at the time we're recording? No. I would take off at least near enough 900 billion off that. And if I take 900 billion off 2.2 trillion, I come to 1.3 trillion. And that is around 60 and a bit percent of GDP. And who cares? It's neither here nor there. It's sort of in the range of the numbers that nobody ever bothered about. And that's the true figure, if you want to call it debt, of actual savings that people have with the UK government. In other words, this is just a non-issue. Can I make up a question to answer now?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
What I would like to ask myself next is, if this is true, what I've just told you is true, why are so many people obsessed with the national debt? Because that's a different question from, is the national debt a problem? And this is what political economy tends to look at rather than pure economics. Because political economy looks at what we would call the power narratives around the allocation of resources within the economy. And those narratives are the stories that we tell each other, which is why economic history is also so important to political economy in a way it isn't to economics. And I happen to think that's more interesting in some ways. But the power narrative that is going on here is between those people who think that government can afford to spend and should spend, and that there are useful things for the government to spend money on. And those people who think that the government shouldn't spend because they think that the government is crowding out, as they would call it, the private sector, and preventing the private sector doing useful things which they believe would happen otherwise. Well, first of all, let's deal with that second argument about crowding out first. There is no evidence that there is a shortage of capital for business anywhere in the world. In fact, if you look in newspapers and search on Google, you will find that there is something called a savings glut. The savings glut is the excess capital around the world, the vast amounts of savings that exist that could be used to provide capital for businesses if people chose to provide it to businesses, but for which business has no use because it has got, frankly, no great idea as to what to do with any money at the moment. So there is no crowding out. Business can get all the capital it requires at almost no cost at present, because its cost of borrowing is also incredibly low, as is the government. So the risk that there is crowding out in the economy as a consequence of government spending is, well, the square root of zero at the moment. So let's not worry about it. So actually what we're talking about here is a political narrative, which is simply some people hate government spending. I have to say that I'm not in that camp. I'm not, nor am I, I'm a former senior partner of a firm of chartered accountants. I run a lot of businesses, etc. I'm decidedly into the mixed economy. I'm pro-business. But I happen to know that having well-educated, healthy employees who have a safety net so that they could afford to work for me when I set up some new businesses and were pretty financially vulnerable in their early days, and I've done my share of startups, and therefore could afford to take that risk, and who had some degree of their pension provided by the state, so therefore there was a little bit of a safety net at the far end of the process, and all those other things were of enormous value to me as an entrepreneur. And I've been an entrepreneur. I've created genuine trading companies. So my belief is that those who actually are arguing against the state providing this safety net that is necessary are in fact really anti-entrepreneurial, in fact, because they're removing the safety net that helps people who create real businesses. I very strongly suspect that most people who don't like government spending for this reason have never set up a business. It's really clear that when you actually look down their CVs, there've been lots of work in think tanks and quite a lot of work around universities and so on, particularly right-wing sort of free market think tanks, but they've never actually taken the risk with their own money, gone out there, slapped it on the table, set up a business, started employing people, tried to make a sale and so on. I've done that, and I really value the support of the state in the process. So for me, it's a symbiotic, powerful, creative relationship between state and private sector. And I don't have a problem with thinking that the state should be making the spending now, which would actually provide a better environment in which new enterprise could be developed. That, to me, is fundamental.
Right, so you'd say there's only a problem with debt if you don't like the spending that has caused it. Is that the...
There isn't a problem with debt ever. People say there's a problem with debt if they don't like the spending.
Right. Yes.
So
yes.
These are powerful narratives. I honestly tell you, I've written, my own blog has 6 million plus words on it, written over 15 years, which is maybe more than that. There's over 18,000 blog posts I've written over 15 years, which before you go to the calculator is over three and a third a day, or so 3.3 a day, every day, 365 days a year for 15 years. It's kind of sad, but it does put you top of the Google searches. If you're really desperate, that works. But the point I'm making is that actually telling stories about economics, trying to understand the narratives is really important, because then you can work out what people are really trying to do with the economics that they tell you is true, but which is actually a reflection of their political belief. All economics is a reflection of political belief, and those who claim otherwise are simply in denial of the fact that they pursue neoliberal economics.
Given perceived costs of, you say, crowding out isn't an issue, there are obviously interest payments on debt. When could crowding out become an issue, and how would a country know if there was a problem with debt or with interest payments being too high?
Well, again, interest payments is an interesting point, because a lot of the people who talk about interest payments being a problem don't seem to have realized that actually interest payments are actually pretty fundamental to making some significant parts of our economy go round. For example, one of the biggest funders of government debt, one of the biggest depositors of money with the government, therefore, are pension funds. And you can say we want to cut interest rates, but the moment you do, you actually make the funding of private pensions a lot harder. So pension funds would actually say, please put up interest payments, because it will make our funding of private pensions, on which a lot of people depend in their retirement, so much easier that we can afford to keep people. So is the payment of interest such a problem in that case? Well, actually, the argument is that people should have private pensions to avoid being dependent upon the state, but then we don't want to pay the interest which they wish to invest in on the bonds they wish to buy and invest in, to give them a return which is sufficient so they're not dependent upon the state. So is interest really such a bad thing? I'm not convinced that it is. We also have to remember that taxes, of course, paid on this interest as well, so it doesn't all immediately disappear into a black hole, never to be seen again, which is again one of the assumptions which is so often made by those who say these costs are terrible and how do we fund them? Well, actually, we fund about a third of most government spending by simply spending it, because it comes straight back in tax. You pay a teacher and they pay 1/3 of their income back in tax. Near enough, on average, that's what they'll pay back. So therefore, the first way in which you fund government spending is by spending it, and that's true of interest. When does interest become a problem? Well, look, it becomes a problem in two ways. And there are states for whom interest is a problem. It's a problem, and historically can be and is a problem, for states who borrow in a currency other than their own. So if you borrow your national debt in dollars and your local currency is, I don't know, francs, I don't know where anybody, I think there are still some countries in Africa who actually don't have francs. But if your local currency is francs and you are forced to borrow in US dollars, then if the interest burden on that debt is constant, but the value of your domestic francs, which is all that you can afford to use to pay that debt, goes down, you're going to be using more and more of your domestic product to service an international financial obligation. That is a problem. So the first rule of borrowing with regard to national debt, if at all possible, is don't borrow in anything but your own currency. 99.5% or more of the UK national debt is in sterling. There's a very little bit in Chinese renminbi, which for some reason George Osborne decided was a good idea in about 2013. It was a silly experiment, and it'll wash its way through the system soon, and there'll be nothing left. And I hope we never repeat the exercise ever again. But the point is, so long as you borrow in your own currency, frankly, whatever the interest rate is, that currency is still going to flow around your economy. So I don't see the risk of there being a major debt. But if we look at the places where it is said that currencies are collapsing because of their debt and interest obligations, whether that be Venezuela or whether that was Zimbabwe or the classic, it's the Weimar Republic in Germany, because everybody says the Weimar Republic, and we're going to end up with pushing around notes in wheelbarrows. Not that many people see a note if you're a young person. I think that they're non-existent as far as I can work out now. If I ever, I happen to have two sons who are of university age, and if I ever wish to give them a note, they give it straight back to me and say, can you transfer it into our bank account, please? Because they don't know what to do with a note. So we're not ever going to end up in that scenario anyway. The point is, all of those countries had other reasons for their debt being a problem. And there are a remarkably short list of countries who are like Zimbabwe and Venezuela and the Weimar Republic. In fact, there's only 26 hyperinflation events, I think, in the last century, which, given the number of countries and the number of opportunities for creation of hyperinflation events there have been, is minuscule. But what were their reasons for failure? Zimbabwe, they decided to reform land ownership and crashed an agricultural economy as a consequence, and became utterly impoverished and issued the local currency in excess amounts to try and solve the problem, and therefore crashed their own economy when they had debts in dollars. End of story. Venezuela, fundamentally involved in a civil war with a direct economic war with the USA. It's sitting there with the USA trying to undermine its economy. Its major product is sold in dollars, and the USA is trying to withhold payments of dollars to Venezuela, therefore creating an internal instability where it runs two currencies the Venezuelan currency, the US dollar, and an instability between them, which is basically destroying the local currency as an effective medium for exchange, and therefore killing it because of this economic warfare going on. Weimar Republic owed all its debt, of course, in other currencies, because it owed its debt as reparations after the First World War to the US, to France, to the UK, and I think a bit to Italy, actually. But all in foreign currencies with an fixed exchange rate in dollars, which it couldn't, in gold, effectively, against a gold standard measure. And Germany was basically barred from making exports, so it couldn't earn the gold that it owed to pay to these foreign currencies for reparations. It was therefore in an impossible situation, tried to devalue its currency to try to stimulate activity, and came into a vicious cycle of collapse, but again, borrowed in the wrong currency. So the collapse in an economy where debt becomes a problem, where interest rate becomes a problem, is never because of the issue of the money or because of the debt itself. There's another fundamental underlying concern, whether it's a reckless local government or economic warfare or an imposition of a liability, whatever it might be. It really isn't that the debt is the issue. These probably aren't the answers you're expecting, but I've rehearsed these over many years with many people, and I've researched it in depth to get to this position where I really do not think debt is the problem. Always look behind the story, is what I would say again. I'm back to stories. Always try to understand the cause, not the evidence you see. In accountancy, we call this substance and form. The form is there's a debt. The substance is there's a deposit of people depositing money with the government. In the case of Weimar Republic, the form was there was a debt crisis. The substance was there was an impossibility of the burden placed upon the country after the First World War. And so try to understand the substance of what's going on, not the form of the transaction you're looking at.
To that end, do you think the main difference then between developed nations and less developed nations with debt is the currencies, that generally less developed nations are forced to borrow in US dollars or other sort of reserve currencies? Do you think that's the main difference between the two?
There's two reasons. There's two reasons for the difference between developed and developing countries, really, with regard to debt. One is, as you've just said, that they are almost invariably borrowing in a foreign currency. And I will criticize the IMF and World Bank for this as well, because they impose debts upon these countries in currencies other than their own. And I personally think they should be willing to give them loans in their own currencies. Frankly, the IMF and World Bank can afford to take the currency risk, and I believe that's their job. And I work with the IMF and World Bank, and I get on with people at the IMF and World Bank. And so, I think there's nothing surprising about me saying this. I think they need to rethink what they're doing. So problem number one is that they are being forced basically to borrow in other currencies. And we've seen this time and again. We saw it throughout the petrodollar crises of the 1980s, where a lot of Eastern European states had to reschedule their debt. We've seen it over numerous Argentinian debt defaults, because they seem to be, it's Tuesday, so there's an Argentinian debt default. I exaggerate slightly, but it's a recurring story in the history of that country, unfortunately, and so on. There's another factor as well, if I am completely honest, with regard to the debt of developing countries, and we can't ignore it. And this is true especially of lesser developed countries, and that is corruption. I've been heavily involved in issues around corruption for a long time. That is, I've not been doing it, I've been researching it and trying to find out what to do about it, because I've written a lot about tax havens and the abuse that is used of them to, both facilitate and hide the proceeds of this crime, and crime it is. In some countries, up to 1/3 of the money provided by way of loans ends up being siphoned off by corrupt elites, taking backhanders, taking commissions, simply raiding the central bank. And that's been evidenced many times, with the money often appearing in a tax haven at some future time. And therefore, the debt that is repayable has never generated a return inside the country, which now has liability for it. And so one of the issues there is about trying to track the illicit proceeds of this transaction. And there are some very good people who are trying to do that. And the World Bank has been very good at trying to track illicit funds and has some very good programs. I think something called the STAR program, I can't remember what, stolen something asset recovery. Was the STAR program. I can't remember what the T was now, but anyway, I sort of saw the work of that program for a while, and there are others. So that's one of the mechanisms. And the second one is debt forgiveness around the amount which has been literally stolen, and knock on the door of the countries where that now is. The most common place of which is Switzerland. I mean, one of the most bizarre things about the corruption perception index produced by something called Transparency International, you can go and look that one up if you like, is that as a measure of corruption, it measures Switzerland very often as the least corrupt place on earth, which is bizarre when it's the home of some of the most corrupt money on earth, hidden in Swiss bank accounts over the years. How they can manage to come up with the corruption perception index, which is almost the inverse of where the corruption really is an interesting scenario. And you have to worry about the role of some NGOs in creating false impressions, false narratives. The substance and form, again, here don't match. And I think that's one of the issues we have to worry about there.
What do you think the Bank of England should do with its asset purchasing program? What do you think should happen to the program as it is at the moment?
Well, I've not been a fan of the asset purchasing program. I wrote that I wasn't in sometime in the middle of 2010. The program was then in its infancy. It was only launched in 2009. And I said that whilst I didn't think it would create inflation, I did think it would create significant asset price inflation. And these are two different things. Asset price inflation, that is the prices of shares, the prices of land and buildings and so on, the things that people invest in, are not reflected in either the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the Retail Price Index, the CPIH, which is the CPI plus housing costs. So the measures of inflation we use for domestic consumption purposes are not the ones which are of relevance when it comes to asset price inflation. And asset price inflation over the last decade has been phenomenal. I did a bit of research looking at this issue, and I think between 2011 and 2018, the total national income of the UK was about £13 trillion. And the value of assets in the UK went up by between £5 and £6 trillion, implying that 50% of all that national income in that period was saved, which of course was utter nonsense. It wasn't. What we'd actually had was, during that period, a QE program which by then was only worth £450 billion, but which, remember that assets are priced at the value of the last transaction. So you value a company on the basis of the last share deal that was recorded on the London Stock Exchange. So you value it at marginal cost, or marginal price. And so the marginal price of these assets had gone up dramatically. So it appeared that wealth had risen enormously. I have problems with that because I think actually significant wealth inequality is seriously harmful to a country by simply creating social resentment and also actually preventing investment. Because the wealthy, if there's one thing that you know about wealthy, and here I'd refer you to an economist called Thorsten Veblen, Thorsen, Veblen, Veblen, little read, except in political economy, writing about a century ago in the most impenetrable English. He was a Norwegian who wrote in English, but it was very hard to read, I have to admit. But the idea he came up with was conspicuous consumption. The desperate desire of the wealthy to be seen to be wealthy, and that wealth itself became their barometer of well-being. Not income, but wealth. And so what we've ended up with is a situation where the wealthy very rarely take risks with regard to their investments. And so, in fact, more and more wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which is what the QE program has created, has blow the politics, just been bad for the economy because it's actually concentrated hands in very low risk investments, which has meant we haven't had a real appetite for risk, which is necessary for growth to take place. Growth, whether it's sustainable or otherwise, doesn't matter. It still requires an appetite for risk. And I would believe in a sustainable version of growth if I could. But the point I'm making is, therefore, QE has problems in it. So I would rather that the program was not increased. I would also, frankly, I'm utterly indifferent to its reversal. In fact, I'm not utterly indifferent to its reversal. I think it should not be reversed. I'm sorry, I should be quite clear about that. Why shouldn't it be reversed? Because this is the money supply. This is actually money sitting on the bank accounts of our banks. I mean, as I explained earlier in this interview, the money that is created by QE is now basically cash deposits sitting on the banks, on the balance sheets of UK banks, which are substantially more secure now than they were in 2009 as a result. And as a consequence, the risk of them failing is very much lower. So QE has provided enormous stability to the UK banking system, even if it hasn't done much else apart from inflate asset prices. Would I wish to reduce the stability of the UK banking system? I can't think of any reason on earth why you would want to reduce the stability of the UK banking system. I knew very well what was happening in weekends during the course of September and October 2008. I was pretty close to the Treasury at that point in time, and it was pretty scary stuff. If you look at some of the blogs I wrote around that time, it was like, have the troops on the street for Monday morning just in case the cash points don't work. And in fact, it nearly reached that point. Or worse, that the card machines in supermarkets won't work because there's nothing so angry as a mother who can't feed their children because her card won't work. So, and that was the risk we were literally at in 2008. So why would I want to take away that stability? Nothing on earth would make me want to take away that stability. Would I, however, leave the existing facility there? It's the money supply. We need it. There isn't an alternative. The money supply is created either by the central bank or by commercial banks. Commercial banks have not been lending over the last decade, so therefore the government has supplied the money instead. It's as simple as that. That's where the money supply came from. Read a paper from the Bank of England in the first quarterly report of Bank of England quarterly report of 2014, which discusses the creation of money to understand that issue in fairly simple terms, by the way. This is one of the easiest to access academic style papers you could ever read, and it's easy to find. Now, what would I do to replace QE? Because I don't want any more of it, really, because I don't want more asset price inflation. I would like to see the government actually specifically spending money into the economy instead of randomly giving money to the banks to repurchase its own debt. So I would have the UK government create its own investment bank, and I would have that investment bank provide the funding for a Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is the sustainable transformation of the UK economy. It would insulate houses. It would generate alternative power sources, including tidal and wind and solar. It would be looking at alternative transport systems. It would be providing the power points that are needed for electric cars. It would be investing in battery technology. It would be looking at tidal power as a new source of offshore energy for the UK, etc. This would provide jobs in every constituency in the UK, and there is a shortage of good jobs, as young people know, with long-term prospects, because it's going to take 20 plus years to do that transformation. 20 years is half a lifetime's work, damn it. I happen to be 63 and I've been working for 42 years, so theoretically I'm coming up to retirement age. I'm not retiring, but that's beside the point. I happen to love my work, so I'm not giving up. But a lot of people would be by now. So 20 years is a lifetime, half a lifetime. Well, that's a great career prospect if we can find jobs in that sector. So I would want the money to go there and the government to buy the bonds issued by the National Investment Bank, I stress National Investment Bank, if nobody else would buy them. Now, in fact, I have other means of directing money into the National Investment Bank anyway by changing the rules about saving. So to try to reduce the savings that I mentioned earlier, to redirect that to social use. So I think there's multiple ways to fund the Green New Deal, but that's how I would now be using QE. But would I be now saying, oh, it must be reversed, as the Governor of the Bank of England implies if he would want to do? Well, only if he wants to crash the economy is my answer. If he wants to take money out of the economy, leave banks vulnerable, leave less money available to provide liquidity to real commercial companies, reduce the national income as a consequence, put a stimulus into reverse, if that's what he wants to do, that's fine. But he has to be honest about the fact therefore his politics is to provide austerity and a recession. If the governor of the Bank of England thinks that's his job, can he please be clear about it? Because I don't think it is.
Do you have any advice for Andrew Bailey or Rishi Sunak on sort of what their priorities should be in the next sort of few years?
Yeah, spend. And seriously, I actually think, look around us, we have major problems in this economy. We have a shortage of decent housing. We are not investing enough to create sustainability. We have an underfunded medical system. We have poor social care. In fact, there's an enormous pent-up demand inside the UK economy for things that the government is denying us effectively the chance to buy. And I would go to Lord Keynes and say, we can afford whatever we can do. It's a very simple summary. It was in his 1941 book. Was it 1940 or 41? I can't remember. It's behind me somewhere in those bookcases. There's a section on Keynes, and it's how to pay for the war. And his argument was we can afford to do whatever we can do, by which he meant if there is the labour resource available to do something, we can do it. Now, we could provide social care, we could provide more teaching, we could provide with suitable training, the skills to build the social housing we need, or the long-term stability for people, because there's a massive crisis in this country of people who are bringing up children in insecure housing situations, which is very damaging for children's education if they have to move too often. That's, we know, harmful. And I could go through long lists of these things that are required. There is no apparent shortage of consumer goods, but nor is there any significant real consumer innovation driving new demand for consumer goods at present. There's also a significant reticence at the moment because of the lack of a social and health safety net for people to spend. I mean, we're recording in September to 2021, and earlier this year the Bank of England was saying, people are going to start spending enormously because COVID's over, and therefore this pent-up spring, which it was said was sitting in the economy, was going to be released and money was going to pour out of savings accounts. There's no evidence of that happening. Why? Because people are frightened that COVID is not over, that it may be for the long term. They've seen universal credit cut. They know that at the beginning of September 2021, there's 1.7 million people still on furlough. And at the end of this month, that scheme ends and those people might all be unemployed. We don't know what's going to happen to them. I could keep going on. The fact is that what we have is a scenario where people are very worried. When people are worried, they naturally save, they become risk averse, and they don't therefore become big consumer users. They don't go out and splash the cash, and I don't think they're going to, because the preference that people now have, and you can argue how they reveal that preference, I agree, but the ballot box might be one way they will in the future, but the preference people now have is for, I think, state-consumed goods, and I believe we actually need to create this underpinning of confidence that it is the job of the state to supply, which then creates the environment in which people are actually willing to go out and take the risk, as I say, of creating businesses, of creating new employment, of taking the risk to generate new products, which is what we're going to need. We're going to need some very interesting new products over the next 30 years or so. Going to look nothing like the ones that we've had in the past if we're going to manage the transition to a sustainable economy. But the point I've got is that at the moment, none of that environment is there. If Rishi Sunak does what Rishi Sunak threatens to do, which is to actually cut, we are going to have a major recession. If we have the Bank of England, for example, increasing interest rates by even a percentage point, that will dramatically increase the cost of mortgage servicing for the 30% or so of UK households that have a mortgage, most of which also have young children, because you have a mortgage at the time that you have young children. I will tell you from experience that's the case. By the time you reach my age in retirement, you hope you paid your mortgage off, because that's the life cycle that these things work through. So at the time of maximum stress and relatively lower income for many households, the government wants to increase the cost of living in a way that is going to be unsustainable for so many households if they put up interest rates. So a combination of a cut in government spending and an interest rate rise, which is what Andrew Bailey and Rishi Sunak would like, would be sufficient to tip this country into significant recession. I believe we need fiscal policy, that is government spending on specific initiatives to drive the economy in new directions to take us forward. And I've got to say that those hotbeds of international socialism, they're called the World Bank, the IMF and the OECD, none of which of course are hotbeds of international socialism, I should add. In fact, most international socialists over the years have absolutely hated all three for being the entrenched bedrock of what they see to be right-wing economics. Those three organizations are all saying that's exactly what the government should be doing now. So what I'm saying is hardly radical if you look at the benchmark of basic economic opinion coming out of those organizations. So I believe that's what they should be doing, but I have a great fear they will do the exact opposite.
Thank you. You don't have any concerns about inflationary pressures or anything like that in the next few years?
No, I don't. I did write a long Twitter thread, which is reflected on my blog 2 or 3 days ago, something around the 29th, 30th of August. And you can find it there on why I don't think there's any inflationary risk of consequence at the moment. Look, there are three fundamental ways in which inflation can rise. One is a shortage of goods, and existing money is chasing a shortage of goods. That's supply chain blockages fundamentally. And we're facing one of those at the moment. I mean, Brexit has caused that. What's the solution? Well, reverse Brexit is the simple answer to that one. Done. I can solve the problem of that particular type of inflation by simply rejoining or even just agreeing to align our regulation with the single market and the customs union regulations for a period of time to allow goods to flow without interference from UK into Northern Ireland and UK into the rest of Europe. And that would solve that particular supply chain problem. That is why we have that particular inflationary pressure now. So that one is a particular type of risk. I mean, the second one is we have too much money chasing too few goods. That would be if we did have excess money creation. For example, QE was used to abandon. Well, there's no evidence that that's happened, so I'm not worried that's going to recur. We have no further actual QE programs planned at present. I think there will be some, although of the sort that I don't want, the sort that Andrew Bailey says he doesn't want to do again, but probably will. That would also come from pay rises, but there have been no pay rises. One of the extraordinary features of the labour shortage we're now suffering is there's no evidence of any pay rises. And it will come from people dissaving, and there's no evidence that people are dissaving. So there isn't any real indication that there's any of that type of inflationary risk within the economy at present. And therefore there's no reason to increase interest rates, because that's the only one which can be tackled by increasing interest rates. And the third type of inflation is the one created by political shock. Now, I've talked about some of those political shocks already there, Venezuela, Zimbabwe and Weimar Republic. In our case, they aren't as extreme as that, but the UK can suffer political shocks, and it did suffer a political shock. And the obvious one was in 2016, we left the European Union, we had the Brexit vote. And then more recently, we actually really left. And those are priced into the exchange rate by allowing for the relative change in productivity between the UK economy before that shock and after that shock. We are now less productive than we were beforehand because there's a significant cost of doing transactions which there wasn't beforehand. And as a result, overall, our exchange rate has suffered by more than 10%. Now, that is therefore going to be imported at some point into the inflation mix. Actually, it's already happened in the case of the UK. We've done that. That adjustment has taken place. So that isn't going to be happening again because we've done it. So is there any other reason why we should get an inflationary risk at the moment? No. Have we got full employment? No. Therefore, are we going to actually see real wages rising because there's going to be major pressure? No, we're not. Is there a strong trade union movement which is going to be able to force wage rises through to compensate people in work if there was an inflationary risk from any of those causes, for example, supply shortages, where there is going to be some short-term inflation in 2021? No, we haven't got a strong trade union movement that is going to be able to enforce that. Therefore, there's frankly no reason to think there's an inflationary risk. If I was on the Monetary Policy Committee, I'd be saying, hold still. wait until there's any evidence at all that there is a real inflationary risk that can be tackled by an interest rate change before we actually make the adjustment. There is no evidence of that at all right now.
Do you have any thoughts on a central bank digital currency?
I have a real problem with the central bank digital currency, because that means, I mean, it's fine to issue it, but who provides the overdraft? Do I want my central bank to be issuing overdraft to people and taking credit risk on people defaulting on their digital currency? I don't mind them issuing a digital currency. I have a problem with them actually lending in a digital currency. So frankly, no, I think digital currencies, we've got a digital currency anyway, all our money is digital now. I just don't see the added value of a digital currency when we've already got electronic money everywhere and the system is working. Don't break what works.
Excellent. Universal basic income? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I've done modelling of UBI. I did it with a great economist called Howard Reed, and we did it a while ago. And we looked at, could we actually provide a real universal basic income, 2/3 of national average earnings, so that was about 16,000 quid at the time. And it required the most phenomenally progressive income tax rate, something up to about 80% at 80,000 of income. Now, of course, at 80,000 of income, you were also potentially getting 2 or 3 or even 4 basic incomes per household, because that was entirely possible, because we were paying a basic income for kids as well as we were paying it for adults. So, it was a weird structure. If you're not going to do it properly and actually do it literally as a basic income, and you're just going to do it to actually undermine the benefit system, no thank you, not a UBI. I'd rather have a proper benefit system. I'd rather increase universal credit. I'd rather get rid of many of the restrictions on universal credit and actually make that a function than a UBI, which would be a half-hearted measure and which would be used to subsidize wages. A job guarantee, a government that is aiming for full employment, I'm much more interested in, but I still see some problems. The problem, can local authorities, who will have to pick up much of that work, do they at present have the capacity to find the jobs for people who need a job guarantee? I don't know. It's a practical problem, not a theoretical one.
Do you think there's anything the UK has done well economically in the last, say, 5 years? Any real things you look back on and think, yeah, that happened really well?
God. And not very often am I left wondering what I'm going to say, and that one is a really difficult question. You've stumped me. Have we done anything well? Well, yes, we have. Yeah, actually, I mean, he claimed completely false credit for it, but the willingness of the Bank of England to intervene in March 2020 to provide stability to the banking system when there was a liquidity crisis, which most people don't realise, but there was a £200 billion plus liquidity crisis arising as coronavirus became an obvious risk in late February, March 2020, was definitely something that was done well. It did prevent a repetition of 2008. So yeah, that was good. The fact that we'd actually learned the lesson and we actually did see the Bank of England intervene was good. Is there anything else? I'm struggling.
Do you have any a favourite historical figure in economics, or favourite economist, perhaps?
Oh, I mean, who should you read, in a sense, is what I mean. I love economic history. I like reading older texts. If I had a favourite economist, it might be Galbraith, J.K. Galbraith. Incredibly influential on me when I was younger. The new industrial state, the affluent society and things. I really found those mind-blowingly interesting and incredibly easy to read. I found Keynes, I read Keynes as a sixth former, which is kind of sad. But there's some very good biographies of Keynes. I read one by someone, I think R.F. Harrod, if I remember rightly, when I was a sixth former, and loved it. So I thought Keynes was a fascinating character. I think there's some really quite interesting alternative thinkers, and you need to perhaps be aware of Minsky, but I'm probably asking a bit much at the moment, given that your average audience here is probably not going to get to Minsky right now. If you really want to go back and read a book which has had an enormous impact, and it's a strange book for having had an enormous impact, and I have to ask myself why. It's a book by a chap called E.F. Schumacher called Small is Beautiful. It was published in early 1970s. I mean, this sounds like I'm going back to all of these are harking back to my sixth form. I mean, I've read an awful lot since, but actually I'm just interested in what my formative texts were. E.F. Schumacher was powerful because he was virtually the first green economist in some practical ways. He wrote this book, which was, we're going to run out of resources. And I've been telling throughout this interview that we tell stories. That's what Schumacher did. He told a story. And I think that we should never underestimate the power of economic narratives. And I guess I'm choosing people who've told good narratives. Keynes changed the economic story. Galbraith did very much the same from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and he told some really interesting ones. His book on money, Whence It Came, Where It Went, is another good one. But Schumacher is, I often wonder what the hell, this book was so influential for. It's weird. And it's quite short, so you're not going to waste a lot of time looking at it, but it's just interesting to see how sometimes you drop a small pebble into a flipping great pond and those ripples do break out. For most economists that never happens. I mean, and the lives of most economists are forgotten, but he wasn't. Would I suggest anybody from the right? No. There is an interesting book which is not a particular person, but a book which I think is interesting, but it's pretty heavy going. It's a book called The Road to Mont Pelerin, if I remember rightly. Hang on, let's go and find it. Is it around somewhere? No, it isn't, because my son's nicked it. My son at university has nicked it. It's not on the bookshelf. Damn it, I actually recommended it to him and it's not on the bookshelf at the moment. Mont Pelerin was really interesting. It was the society formed by Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, of course being his major work, and Milton Friedman. And they set this up to create the think tanks which were going to create neoliberalism as a history of how, again, people created stories to change the economic history. It's very interesting because they created hordes of think tanks in the UK and the USA, the Institute for Economic Affairs, Centre for Policy Studies and so on. These things were created to change the story. So it tells you how this storytelling idea is so important to economics. You may learn all that maths, all that theory, all those graphs, but actually it's the stories that make the difference.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all for today. We hope you've enjoyed this in-depth video, and if you want to hear more from Richard, then you can read his blog over at taxresearch.org.uk, and you can even watch Richard's own videos by searching for Richard J. Murphy on YouTube. But thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.